Nolan Birch was 73 and had spent 4 decades making furniture by hand. Ida was 70 and had spent 26 years managing the accounts and fiber archive at the Millward Regional Textile Museum. They had been married for 46 years and had a specific habit of stopping at things other people had walked past. That spring, they paid $900 for the old Hatchett's Mill General Store on Depot Road. The store had been closed for 18 years. The auctioneer dropped the price 3 times before Nolan raised his hand. Mayor Vera Odom told the Hatchett's Mill Courier she was grateful the property would finally be addressed. Ida asked Nolan what he thought the mayor meant by finally. Nolan said he thought she meant the same thing everyone meant when they said it about something they had not addressed themselves. What they found behind the false wall in the back warehouse had not been seen since 1903. 12 months later, the university sent a team of 4. But I need to take you back to the beginning. The Hatchett's Mill General Store had operated continuously on Depot Road from 1871 through 2006, which was 135 years of the same building doing the same work in the same location, which was the kind of continuity that becomes invisible the way anything does when it goes on long enough without interruption. The store had served as the commercial center of Hatchett's Mill through 5 generations of the Crane family, who had founded it and run it and handed it from parent to child across the decades until the last of the Cranes in direct succession, a man named Porter Crane, had died in 2003 without a successor willing to take it on, and the store had operated on reduced hours through the final 2.5 years of its life before closing in 2006. In the specific way of things that have been ending for a while before the ending is official. The building itself was a substantial 2-story timber frame structure on the south side of Depot Road. Its lower floor given over to the original retail space and its upper floor to storage, and the living quarters the Crane family had used in the earlier generations before building a proper house across the street in the 1890s. Behind the retail space, connected by a wide door, was the back warehouse, a lower single-story addition in the same timber frame construction added sometime in the 1880s to accommodate the store's growing dry goods inventory. The loading dock on the warehouse's south face was where the delivery wagons had come and where the trucks had come later, and it was still intact, its heavy plank surface gray and weathered but sound in the way of construction built to hold significant weight across a long working life. The county had listed the store 3 times over the 18 years of its closure. The first listing, in 2010, had drawn 2 inquiries that came to nothing because the building's condition at that point was already daunting for anyone without the specific skills to read it correctly. The second listing, in 2017, had drawn 1 serious inquiry from a regional developer who had walked through the building and left without making an offer. The third listing was the auction at which Nolan and Ida Birch paid $900. The auctioneer had opened at $4,000. The room, which held 9 people, had not moved. He dropped to 3. Still nothing. He dropped to 2, and a man near the front looked at his wife, and his wife shook her head. He dropped to $1,500, and the room arrived at the specific quality of silence that precedes a lot being withdrawn. Then Nolan raised his hand at $900. The auctioneer looked at him the way auctioneers look at a hand that resolves a difficult lot, with professional gratitude that has nothing to do with the price and everything to do with the morning being able to continue. Nolan had been to the building twice before the auction. Both times he had stood at the front window and looked through the glass at the interior, his hands cupped at the sides of his face to block the daylight reflection. He had not been inside. He had looked at the timber frame visible in the ceiling joists through the window, at the counter, at the walls, at the degree to which the building's fundamental structure was still doing what it had always done, which was holding. He had told Ida the frame was sound. Ida had told him she knew. She had been to the building once herself, separately, on a Tuesday morning when Nolan was in his shop. She had not looked through the front window. She had walked around the building's perimeter, including through the alley beside the warehouse, where the warehouse wall had a small high window near its roofline. She had stood on the bottom rung of a fence and looked through that window into the warehouse, with her hand lens pressed to the glass. The warehouse interior was dark, but in the daylight coming through the window she could see shelving along the far wall, and on the shelving, shapes. She had not told Nolan about the fence or the hand lens. She would tell him when they were inside. After the auction, while Nolan was completing the transfer paperwork, Ida took the aprons from her bag and set his on the seat beside her. It was a practice they had developed years ago when they took on a new project together. The aprons going on before the first day's work as a kind of quiet agreement about what was beginning. His was leather, a cabinet maker's apron, worn to a dark patina from 4 decades of sawdust and linseed oil and the accumulated contact of his craft. Hers was canvas, carrying the specific stains of 26 years of archival work, the pale brownish marks of acid-free tissue handling, and the mineral residue of the humidification work she had done in the museum's fiber conservation lab. She set his apron on the seat and kept her own in her lap and waited. He came back and looked at the apron on the seat. He picked it up without putting it on. He said they should probably see the inside first. She said she thought that was right. He said after that they should put the aprons on. She said she expected so. The key the county had given him opened the front door on the second try, the lock stiff from 18 years without use. The door swung inward and the smell of the store came out to meet them, the specific smell of old timber and old merchandise and the dry accumulated time of a commercial space that has not been a commercial space for 18 years, which is not the smell of rot, but the smell of continuity interrupted. Nolan stepped in. The retail space was large, running the full width of the building from the front windows to the warehouse door, perhaps 40 feet deep. The original shelving was still on 3 walls, empty, the shelf brackets sound in the wall framing. The floor was wide plank pine, dusty but dry and intact. The ceiling joists were exposed, the original hand-hewn timber, the tool marks of the hewing still visible at 150 years' distance. The pressed tin ceiling panels, original to a renovation the Cranes had done around 1900, were intact and only lightly oxidized. And the counter. The counter ran the full length of the retail space's east wall, from the front of the store to the back door into the warehouse, which Nolan measured at just under 22 feet. It was a single plank. One piece of wood, 22 feet long and 28 inches wide. A black walnut slab of a thickness Nolan estimated at 4 inches before he had his tape on it. The surface was worn smooth from 135 years of transactions, the front edge rounded by the hands and elbows of generations of customers leaning into it. The wood's figure was visible even under the grime, the specific swirling figure of a walnut slab cut from the heart of a very large, very old tree, the kind of tree that had been old when the store was new. Nolan put both hands flat on the counter and did not speak. Ida came to stand beside him. She put her hand on the counter and then bent to look at the end grain at the near end of the slab, which showed the full cross-section of the plank, the growth rings, and the figure visible in a crosscut that must have taken considerable effort with the tools of 1871. She said she had never seen a single plank counter of this length. Nolan said he did not think many people had. She said what kind of tree produced a plank of this width and length. He said a black walnut that was very old and had been given a great deal of room to grow, the kind of tree the eastern forests had produced before the timber industry reduced the available size of what was left. He said this plank had come from a tree that was probably 300 years old when it was felled, and that trees of that dimension were gone from the eastern forests and would not come back in any human lifetime. She said she thought that made the counter something that could never be replaced. He said he was certain of that. They stood at the counter together for a while. Then Nolan went to the warehouse. The warehouse was 40 feet by 30, its ceiling lower than the retail space, the floor packed earth. The shelving along the walls was the original construction, heavy timber shelf supports and wide pine boards built to hold significant weight. Most of the shelving was empty, the inventory removed or deteriorated, and what remained on the visible shelves was the residue of a business's end, a few empty tins, a broken drawer pull, a coil of rope that had gone brittle. But along the far wall of the warehouse, the north wall, the shelving looked different. The wall itself looked different. It was set back from the warehouse's north exterior wall by about 2 feet, a gap not visible from the warehouse floor until you walked toward it, at which point you could see the gap between the back of the shelving and the exterior wall behind it. The shelving on this wall was not empty. It was covered. A panel of tongue and groove pine boards had been fitted over the front of the shelving from floor to ceiling, running the full width of the north wall, a false face of plain pine boards that looked, from a distance, like a section of wall. Nolan walked toward it. Up close, the seam between the false panel and the adjacent walls was visible. The pine boards of the panel were the same age as the warehouse, not a recent addition, and they were fitted carefully, the work of someone who understood joinery. The boards were edge-matched, and the grain ran consistently across them, which meant they had been cut from the same stock and fitted with the intention of the panel reading as a single unbroken surface from a distance, which it did. From 15 feet away, it looked like a wall. From 3 feet away, it looked like something you could not open. From 6 inches away, it looked like something that was designed to be opened by someone who knew what they were looking for. There was no handle visible and no obvious opening mechanism. Nolan ran his hand along the right edge of the panel in the methodical way he ran his hand along any surface he was trying to read, and found what he was looking for on the third pass, a recessed wooden catch fitted flush with the edge of the board, worn smooth from the last time it had been pressed, invisible from any distance and entirely evident at contact. He stood with his finger on the catch for a moment. He could hear Ida moving in the retail space on the other side of the warehouse door. He called her. She came through and stood beside him at the panel. She looked at the seam and then at the catch his finger was on. She said nothing. He pressed it. The panel swung outward on wooden pivot hardware, the whole section of pine boards moving in one piece, hinged at the left, the pivot operating cleanly despite 120 years without use. Whoever had made this had made it to last and had made it to open without effort, which told Nolan something about what they had intended when they sealed it. You did not build something to open easily unless you expected someone to eventually open it. Behind the panel, in the 2-foot space between the false wall and the exterior warehouse wall, was the original shelving of the Hatchett's Mill General Store's dry goods inventory in cedar-lined fitted shelving built specifically to protect the contents from moisture and insect damage. The cedar was still fragrant after 120 years. The contents of the shelves were what had been there when the door was closed in or around 1903. He called Ida. She came from the retail space and stood beside him and looked at what the flashlight was showing. Bolts of fabric folded and stacked in the cedar shelving, their colors faded to softness, but their structure intact. A full set of tin canisters with painted labels, the pigment still readable. Tools in their original paper wrapping, the paper yellowed but unbroken. A row of glass bottles with ground glass stoppers, their contents dark and crystallized. And on the lowest shelf of the cedar section, in a row along the full width of the wall, a set of ledger books, 12 of them, bound in dark cloth, their spines labeled in the same handwriting, with dates running from 1874 through 1903. Ida looked at the ledgers for a long time without touching them. Then she said she needed her gloves. Nolan said he thought she probably did. She went to her bag in the retail space and came back with her cotton conservation gloves, the white ones she had used for 26 years handling archival materials, and she crouched at the lowest shelf and read the spine labels one by one without touching the books. She said the handwriting on the spines changed 3 times across the series. 3 different people had labeled these ledgers over the 30 years they covered. 3 generations of the Crane family, keeping accounts in the same books, passing them to the next generation without interruption. She said she thought these ledgers documented the complete commercial history of Hatchett's Mill from its earliest years through the turn of the century. Nolan said he thought she was right. She said she needed to call someone. He said she should call whoever she needed to call. Mayor Vera Odom had been mayor of Hatchett's Mill for 5 years and had, in that time, maintained a publicly supportive position on the general store situation while doing nothing in particular about it, which was not unusual for a building that presented no imminent public safety concern and whose ownership had been a county matter. She had told the Hatchett's Mill Courier after the auction that she was grateful the property would finally be addressed, and she had meant it, which was different from having caused it to happen. James called from Denver that same week. He was their son, 45 years old, an architect who had strong opinions about building conditions and who had grown up watching his father work wood and his mother work archives, and had concluded from both that restoration projects had a way of expanding beyond their original scope. He asked his father what the structural assessment looked like. Nolan said he had done his own assessment and the frame was sound. James said a self-assessment from a cabinet maker was not a structural report. Nolan said he had been reading timber frames for 40 years and knew the difference between sound and not sound, and this one was sound. James said he was not disputing his father's competence with wood. He was pointing out that a $900 purchase price on an 18-year closed commercial building was a signal that the market had already formed an opinion. Ida got on the phone and told James about the counter. James was quiet. She described the single-plank black walnut counter, 22 feet of a tree that was probably 300 years old when it was felled. She told him there was no other documented counter of this length from a single plank in the state. She said his father's hands had been on it for 20 minutes and he had not moved. Well, James said he would like to see it. Ida said she thought June would be a good time and he should plan on staying at least 3 days. The work in the store began the following week. Nolan started with the counter because the counter was the reason the store existed, and because he needed to understand it before he could understand anything else about the building. He spent the first 3 days cleaning a section of the counter's surface, working from the front window end toward the warehouse door, using the same materials and patience he used on the antique furniture pieces his shop had always specialized in, a careful progression of appropriate solvents and cloths, moving slowly and not pushing the surface. The work was methodical and entirely absorbing, the register of patient incremental revelation he had spent 40 years working in, removing what time had put onto a surface without removing what the surface itself had to say. He worked in the mornings with the front windows cleaned and the morning light coming in at an angle that showed the surface's condition clearly. On the third day, a 10-foot section near the front window was fully cleaned. The black walnut surface in the afternoon light was the specific deep warm brown of old walnut that has been properly cared for across a long life, the grain swirling in the complex pattern of a very large old tree's heartwood. The wear from 135 years of use was visible as a gentle depression along the center of the working area, worn by the friction of packages and coins and hands and the ordinary commerce of 5 generations. Ida stood beside the cleaned section in the afternoon light. She said it was extraordinary. Nolan said he thought it was the finest piece of wood he had touched in 40 years of working with wood. She said that was saying something. He said he was aware of that. While Nolan worked on the counter in the mornings, Ida worked in the cedar room. She had developed her documentation methodology during her years at the Millwood Textile Museum for recording textile collections in situ before any objects were moved, and she applied that methodology to the cedar room's contents systematically, working from the top shelf down and from left to right, photographing each object in its position before noting its condition in her right-hand pages. The work was quiet and close and required the kind of sustained attention that archival work always required, the attention of someone who understands that what is being documented now may be the only record that survives if something goes wrong later. She took her time because the time was warranted and because hurrying in a cedar room full of things that had lasted 120 years seemed like a poor way to honor the fact of their survival. The fabric bolts occupied the upper 2 shelves on both sides of the narrow room. She documented each one by its visible color and weaved structure and approximate dimensions before touching it, then carefully unfolded the outer edge of each bolt just enough to assess the fiber structure inside without exposing the interior to unnecessary air. What she found each time was consistent with the cedar room's promise. The fiber was intact, the colors were muted from the original but present. The weave was sound. On the third bolt she opened, a heavy domestic wool in what had been a dark blue. She found a paper tag still attached to the bolt's core, handwritten in ink that was faded but legible. It gave the weight in yards and the supplier's name and the date of receipt. September 1897. 126 years in the dark, and you could still read the date. She sat back on her heels and looked at the tag for a moment. Then she wrote the date in her notebook. She called her former colleague at the Millwood Regional Textile Museum, a conservator named Beth Haas, who had been working in fiber conservation for 30 years. She told Beth what she had found. Beth asked questions in the order a conservator asks questions, starting with physical conditions and working toward content. The discipline of someone who knows the container matters as much as what is contained. She asked if the textiles were in direct contact with wood. Ida said they were in cedar-lined shelving with no contact with raw wood surfaces. Beth said cedar was the correct thing for long-term textile storage, and that if the seal had held, they should be in recoverable condition. She asked if she could come. Beth drove up from Millwood on a Friday in the second week, and spent a full day with the cedar room, going through the textile inventory with the same white cotton gloves Ida used and the same methodical care, unfolding the edges of each bolt without opening them fully to assess the fiber condition, making notes, asking Ida questions in the low concentrated voice they had both developed from years of working in archival spaces where raised voices felt wrong. At the end of the day, Beth sat on an overturned crate in the warehouse and said the textiles were in remarkable condition. She said remarkable specifically and without qualification. She said the cedar had done what cedar was designed to do, and that whoever had sealed that room in 1903 had understood what they were sealing, and had done it correctly. She said the fabric bolts included examples of domestic textile production from the late 19th century that she had only seen in museum collections, and that the condition of these examples was better than several pieces she knew of in active preservation programs. She said she thought there were people who needed to know about this. Ida said she thought so too. Gus Fremont appeared in the second week. He was 71 years old and had delivered the mail in Hatchett's mill for 34 years before retiring. And in those 34 years, he had come to know every building in the town with the specific intimacy of someone who visits the same places 5 days a week across 3 decades, who knows which locks stick and which porches sag and which back doors are left unlocked and which buildings have been slowly becoming something different from what they appear on the outside. He had watched Hatchett's mill change across his working years, and had watched the general store close, and had watched it sit, and had developed, over the years, a quiet conviction that the store was more than what the county's listings described. He had been watching the activity at the property since the auction, and had decided one Wednesday that he was curious enough to stop. He came in through the front door and stood in the retail space and looked at the space with the unhurried assessment of someone who has been inside a great many rooms and is not easily impressed by them. Then he looked at the cleaned section of the counter and walked to it. He put his hand on the walnut surface the way everyone put their hand on it, flat, feeling. He asked Nolan what the wood was. Nolan told him. Gus said he had delivered mail to this building twice a week for the last 12 years of the store's operation, and had leaned on that counter every one of those deliveries and had never known what it was. Nolan said most people had not. Gus said he thought that was probably true of most things that were what they were for a long time. He said people stopped seeing them. He said he had thought about that a great deal since he retired, the things he had passed for 34 years without looking at correctly. Nolan said he understood that. Gus stood at the counter for a while and then said he knew something about the building they might not have found yet. He said the previous owners, the Crane family in their last generation, had mentioned to him once that the building had a second water source separate from the town main, the original well used before Hatchett's mill had municipal water, and that it was somewhere in the basement under the retail space. Nolan said the building did not appear to have a basement. Gus said that was what was interesting about it. He said he could show them where the access was if they wanted to look. They wanted to look. Gus went to the built-in shelving along the east wall, below the counter's far end, and found the panel there with a directness that suggested he had thought about this more than once. Not a false wall like the cedar room, but a built-in cabinet section, one of 6 matching sections under the counter, hinged rather than fixed at its back, swinging inward on pivot hardware similar to the cedar room panel but smaller, the work of the same hand or the same tradition. Behind it, stone stairs descended into the dark, their treads worn smooth at the center from 130 years of feet. The basement was not large, perhaps 15 feet by 20, with a low stone ceiling and a packed earth floor. Its stone walls were the original construction, hand-fitted in the dry stack tradition of someone who knew stone and knew pressure, and knew that fitted stone without mortar, done correctly, was stronger than mortared stone done carelessly. The walls were sound. In the center of the east wall, a stone-lined well shaft went down into the dark, its curbing intact, its wooden cover in place. Nolan lifted the cover. The well was dry. It had been dry for a long time, but the stone curbing was intact and the well shaft was clear, and the stone-lined walls of the shaft were as sound as the day they were built, which Nolan estimated at somewhere in the 1870s based on the fitting style and the tool marks on the curbing stones. He stood with his flashlight and said it was the cleanest dry stack stonework he had seen in this county. Ida, on the stairs, said she thought Porter Crane had known the basement was there and had not mentioned it to the county when the building was listed. Gus, at the top of the stairs, said that was consistent with Porter Crane's general approach to official matters in his final years. Nolan said they should put that in the notebook. Ida was already writing. If you have made it this far into Nolan and Ida's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Beth Haas had been corresponding with colleagues in the university system since her visit to the Cedar Room. In the 4th month, she copied a professor named Gerald Adair at the university's Department of Material Culture History, who had read her description of the Crane family ledgers and the textile inventory, and asked if he could bring a small team to assess the collection. Ida called him and said yes. Gerald came in the 5th month with 3 graduate students and spent 4 days in the Cedar Room and the retail space with cameras and notebooks and white cotton gloves, going through the inventory with the unhurried care of someone who has spent his career in the company of irreplaceable things and understands that irreplaceable things require unhurry as a baseline condition of engagement. He was in his 50s, compact and deliberate, the kind of academic who had never lost the fieldwork habit. On the 4th day, he sat with Nolan and Ida at the walnut counter and said the Crane family ledgers were a primary source document for the commercial and social history of Hatchett's mill and the surrounding county from 1874 through 1903 that he was not aware of any parallel to in the state's regional archives. He said the textile inventory was a significant material culture collection that his department had been actively seeking documented examples of for a preservation research program. He said he would like to propose a formal partnership that would involve the department providing professional conservation support for both the ledger collection and the textile inventory in exchange for research access. He said he would also like to propose the building be considered for designation as a working heritage site, which would qualify it for a category of state preservation grant not available to private properties without the designation. Nolan and Ida looked at each other. Nolan said they needed a few days to think about it. Gerald said to take all the time they needed. They discussed it for 2 evenings at the counter, both notebooks open, Nolan's left-hand pages with the structural implications and Ida's right-hand pages with the archival and designation questions going back and forth between the pages, the way they had gone back and forth between things for 46 years. At the end of the second evening, they had a list of conditions on each side of the open notebooks, and they compared the two lists and found they were asking the same questions from different directions, which was what they usually found. They called Gerald on the third morning and said yes, with conditions. He agreed to 11 of the 12 conditions without discussion. The 12th, he proposed a modification to that Ida wrote into a right-hand page, and Nolan approved from across the counter. They brought a structural engineer named Pete Rule from Kelsey County in the third week. Pete spent a full day in the building and told Nolan the timber frame was sound where it counted, with 2 sections of the second-floor framing needing sistering and a section of the roof sheathing over the warehouse needing replacement before the next winter, but not an emergency in the current dry season. Nolan called James. He told James what Pete had found. James was quiet and then said that a licensed structural report was what he had been asking for, and that this one said what his father had said it would say. Nolan said he was glad James had the report. James said he was coming in June. He came in June as Ida had suggested, driving down from Denver over 2 days, arriving on a Friday evening with the specific unhurried composure of a man who has been thinking about what he is about to see for 3 months and has decided to arrive without conclusions. He walked into the retail space and went directly to the counter the way everyone went directly to the counter once they had been told about it. But he went to it differently from most people, stopping at the near end first and crouching to look at the end grain the way Ida had looked at it on the first day, reading the cross-section with the eye of someone whose profession required him to understand wood and structural systems. He was there for several minutes before he stood up. Then he put both hands on the cleaned walnut surface and stood for a full minute. He said he would like to know the tree's age. Nolan said his estimate was 300 years at felling based on the ring spacing at the end grain, but that an arborist would give a proper count. James said he was going to find an arborist. He spent 3 days as Ida had suggested. He walked every floor of the building with Nolan and asked questions in the specific mode of an architect assessing a structure he has not previously worked with but intends to understand fully. Questions about the timber joinery at the second-floor beam connections and the original framing sequence and the logic of the warehouse addition, and how the loading dock was integrated into the original structure's drainage. Nolan answered everything and found in James, for the first time in a long time, someone who asked questions about buildings at the right level of depth. He went into the cedar room and stood in front of the fabric bolts and the ledgers in Ida's white cotton gloves, which she handed him at the cedar room door without comment. He stood for a long time in the narrow space, the flashlight moving slowly across the shelves, and then crouched at the lowest shelf and read the spine labels of the ledger books one by one without touching them. He stood up and stood in the cedar room for a while longer and then came out. He went into the basement and looked at the dry well and the dry stacked stone curbing and put his hand on the fitted stone wall and pressed. On the second day, he said he had been wrong to characterize the purchase price as a market signal. Nolan said it was a reasonable interpretation. James said it was the interpretation of someone who had not been in the building. Nolan said most interpretations of buildings were made by people who had not been in the building. James said he thought that was probably true about most things. On the third day, he sat at the walnut counter with a coffee Ida had made and his own notebook open and was quiet for a while. Then he said he had been thinking about what it meant that Porter Crane had left the cedar room sealed and the basement panel hidden and the well cover in place and the counter uncleaned across 18 years of attempting to sell the building. He said he did not think Porter Crane had been trying to deceive anyone. He said he thought Porter Crane had known that the building needed a specific kind of person to take it on, and had trusted that the right person would find the things worth finding when the time came. Nolan said he had thought something similar. James said that required a particular kind of faith in people that he was not sure he shared, but that he was glad someone had. He went back to Denver on Sunday and called an arborist on Monday. She drove up from Kelsey County the following Wednesday and spent an hour with a hand lens and a reference chart at the counter's near end. She said her count put the tree at 312 years old at the time of felling, which meant the walnut tree, whose single plank formed the Hatchett's Mill general store counter, had germinated around 1560. She said the plank was the longest documented single-plank counter surface in the state. She said she would be surprised if it were not the longest in the region. She said she would like to write this up for the State Forestry Journal. Nolan said she was welcome to anything she needed. Vera Odom came to the store in the 7th month. She had been to the building twice since the auction, once officially on a town business visit, and once on a Saturday morning on her own, when she had walked through slowly and stood at the walnut counter for a long time without saying much. On the official visit, she had asked appropriate questions and noted the progress and left. On the Saturday visit, she had not asked questions. She had looked at the counter and walked through the warehouse and stood at the cedar room doorway and then left without saying what she was thinking. The Saturday visit had produced a change in something in her expression that she had not addressed publicly, but that Nolan had noticed when he watched her go. She came in the 7th month with something to say. She stood at the walnut counter and put her hand on it the way everyone put their hand on it, and left it there a moment longer than most people did. She ran her palm slowly along the surface in the direction of the grain, the gesture of someone who has finally stopped moving past something and is actually feeling what is there. Then she turned to Nolan and Ida and said she owed them a better statement than the one she had given the courier after the auction. She said finally addressed was the language of someone who had assigned the building to a category called problem and had been comfortable leaving it there. And that was not a generous framing of a building that had served Hatchett's Mill for 135 years, and had been waiting for the right people to come back to it. She said she had been in the building now, and she understood the difference between the building and the category she had put it in. Ida said she appreciated that. Vera asked if there was anything the town could do in support of the heritage designation process. Nolan said the town's formal letter of support for the designation application would strengthen it considerably, and he had been hoping to ask for it. Vera said she would have it on her desk before the end of the week. She was as good as her word. The letter arrived at the County Historic Preservation Office before Thursday. The heritage designation was granted in the 9th month. The university conservation team arrived in the 10th month to begin the formal assessment and stabilization of the cedar room contents. They set up a field station in the warehouse, their equipment filling the space with the purposeful order of archival field work. James came back for the working weekend when the university team arrived. He spent 2 days watching the process and asking questions of Gerald's graduate students, who by the 2nd day were asking him questions in return about the timber frame and the counter and the basement stone construction. On Sunday evening, James stood at the counter beside Nolan with both hands on the walnut surface in the last light coming through the front windows. He said he had been wrong about this building. Nolan said he had told him what the building was. James said he had told him the frame was sound, which was true but was not the same thing as what the building was. Nolan said he was glad James could see the difference. James said he thought he was going to look into the state's Working Heritage Site program more seriously for his practice. Nolan said he thought that sounded like a good use of James's skills. They stood at the counter and said nothing further for a while, which was the right thing to say next. On an evening in the store's first full year as a working heritage site, after Gerald's team had finished their day's work and the retail space was quiet and the archival equipment hummed in the warehouse, Nolan and Ida sat together at the walnut counter on 2 of the original store stools that Gus Fremont had found in his garage. Bought at the estate sale after Porter Crane died and kept without quite knowing why for over 20 years. He had brought them in on a Tuesday morning 3 months into the project, set them down without explanation, and said he thought they belonged back at the counter. Neither Nolan nor Ida had suggested otherwise. Both notebooks were open on the counter surface, side by side, Nolan's left-hand pages had the building's structural notes from the full year, the timber frame assessment and the second-floor sistering, and the warehouse roof replacement, in the basement dry stack stone documentation, and a sketch of the cedar room dimensions he had made on the first week and refined over the months as the room was more fully understood. Ida's right-hand pages had the archive and textile notes, the inventory columns and the conservation correspondence and the heritage designation details and the university partnership conditions in her tight, organized script. Their matching aprons were on the hook on the post inside the front door, side by side as they always were at the end of a day's work, his leather and dark from 4 decades of furniture making. Hers canvas and carrying the year's new marks from the cedar room, work alongside 30 years of museum marks, the particular pale residue of acid-free tissue paper and the faint archival dust she had been collecting in the fabric since the first day she put it on in the auction room. Together, the 2 aprons on the single hook were the record of what the 2 people who wore them had done their whole working lives and what they were still doing. Nolan was looking at the walnut counter surface, not assessing it, just looking at it the way you look at something you have come to know well enough to stop analyzing and simply be in the presence of. Ida was writing in her right-hand pages. She finished a line and looked up at the counter too. She said she thought about Porter Crane sometimes. Nolan said he did too. She said she thought Porter Crane had known what was behind that wall and what was in the cedar shelving, and had not told the county because he had been waiting for the right person to find it. She said she had no evidence for this. Nolan said he thought the same thing without evidence. He said James had said something similar on his 3rd day about Porter Crane's faith in the right person finding what was there, and that he had thought about it since. She said some things you believed without evidence because the evidence was in the thing itself, in the care that had been taken and preserved across 120 years. Nolan said he thought that was correct. She said she thought Porter Crane would have been glad it was them. Nolan looked at the counter for a moment, and then at Ida. He said he thought Porter Crane would have been glad about the counter in particular because whatever he had known about what was behind the false wall, he had walked past this counter every day of his life and might not have understood what he was walking past. Ida said she thought that was probably right. She said a great deal of the best things in the world were walked past every day by the people who were closest to them. Nolan said he thought she was right and that it was a good thing some people had a habit of stopping. She said she supposed it was. He went back to his notebook. She went back to hers. The walnut counter was between them and around them, and the building was quiet, and the cedar room held its contents in the dark behind the false wall that was no longer false. And outside, Depot Road was quiet, and the Hatchett's Mill General Store was doing the same work it had always done, which was holding things that mattered until the right people came to understand what they were holding. I want to know how Nolan and Ida's story sat with you. Leave it in the comments below. Whatever you felt when you understood what was behind the false wall, or when you heard the age of that tree, belongs there, and I want to read it. Tell me where you are watching from today. This channel finds people in places I do not always expect, and every location in the comments is a reminder that these stories carry further than they were built to. And I want to ask you something that Nolan and Ida keep asking me. How many things do you walk past every day that you have not looked at closely enough to understand what they are? Not buildings, not stores, anything. A relationship, a skill, a place, a piece of your own history that has been sitting there in the dark behind something that looks like an ordinary wall. Nolan paid $900 for a building the county had been trying to give away for 18 years. He put his hands on the counter on the first day and did not move. Some things are exactly what they look like when you finally stop and put your hands on them. What is the thing you have not stopped for yet? Thank you for spending this time with Nolan and Ida, and with this channel. The next story is already waiting. I think you will want to hear it.